Chapter 18, Parts 1 to 2. Chapter 18, Kronus, Aftermath. Part 1, His Holy Light. Dauntless-class light cruiser temple ship, en route to Kronus. As soon as news about the Imperial Guard moving in force towards Kronus reached Cardinal Maxwell Lynn, the sector's spiritual leader, the old man moved the heavens themselves to get an expedition underway. It was long known among the Ecclesiarchy in the region that the Cardinal opposed abandoning Imperial worlds to the despicable Tau at every opportunity. Cardinal Lynn was also a loud voice for reclaiming lost systems. More importantly, the citizens left to the Xenos' terrible whims. Unfortunately, opportunities to fix such wrongs failed to materialize for decades. Until now, that is. That was how missionary Jacob Wolf found himself sent to Cronis with utmost dispatch as soon as he returned from his last mission, bringing a feudal world into the fold. That had been a relatively straightforward and simple affair. The locals loved the Imperial Creed. That was especially true when it came with a semblance of passable technology improving their lot in life. Tech priests exiled from Stygia 7 for being too vocal in their interpretations of Mechanicus doctrine saw to that with the inimitable passion of people who had something to prove. Jacob crossed his large arms in front of his chest and gripped his elbows, a habit showing his immense frustration. You'd think we're flying straight at Holy Terror. Steel-like muscles shifted and Wolf's hands formed the Aquila before returning to gripping his elbows. A few years ago, just before leaving for Jackman's world, Jacob had the utmost privilege of meeting Saint Anais, the newest living saint, serving with the Order of the Sacred Rose. The Blessed Woman had just arrived in their corner of the Ultima Segmentum to aid in smiting the Emperor's enemies along with Canoness Selina Agnia and substantial reinforcements all the way from Pacificus. There was no mistaking the soothing radiance of the Emperor after you experienced it once. It was divinity. It was humanity's faith made manifest for everyone to see and bask into. What the navigators of the small Ecclesiarchy fleet described, along with the raving words of the handful of sanctioned psykers on board, pointed at a simple conclusion. Something momentous happened on Cronis. Perhaps the Emperor agreed with Cardinal Lynn and sent one of his rare saints to bring the faithful back into the fold and save them from xenopredations. For days now, everyone on board not busy running the ship or guarding critical areas had been praying reverently to the God Emperor for guidance and salvation. Despite his faith, Wolf found it hard to believe the Emperor answered all the way out here when there would be so many more important places across the Imperium deserving his attention more. Of course, such a thought was presumptuous in itself. Jacob certainly didn't dare consider himself an expert on what the Emperor might deem valuable enough for his attention. The large black man smiled mirthlessly. His lips moved in silent prayer, revealing 2 rows of golden teeth etched with holy symbols. A much younger Jacob got them thanks to a particularly vicious orc, who sucker-punched him twice while he tried to explain to the brute the Emperor's light. In hindsight, trying to convert a half-dead burning orc might have been a bit overzealous. Even the confessor in charge of purging the Greenskins' incursion had agreed, before dousing the brute with even more holy flame. He often thought about that nameless confessor. The old man had forsaken his name after retiring from the Imperial Guard. The confessor lived only to safeguard the faith and souls of the citizenry under his protection. The confessor taught Jacob several important life lessons. While there was a place for zeal and blind faith, occasionally you had to temper them with reason. The Imperium was large, and the God Emperor usually had more important things to do than help young fools with an overly inflated sense of importance. That was especially true when those same fools didn't stop for a moment and think, using what little sense the Emperor might have blessed them with. Jacob didn't consider himself a particularly bright man. If he was, he might have joined the Adeptus Mechanicus, serving the God Emperor in his omniscient guise. Instead, it was the faith that drew him in, rose him from the streets, and showed him the way. The missionary never regretted his chosen path, even if many of his colleagues were a bit too in love with burning incense. That was especially true over the past few days, resulting in thick clouds of white smoke carrying through the great ship's corridors. At least they had access to the tolerable incense this time around. Armored boots clacked over the deck, and a tall figure clad in power armor joined Jacob near the entrance to the bridge. Jacob's nose twitched at the sharp smell of holy oils and freshly applied purity seals. "Missionary Wolf, I'm glad to report everything seems in order. All vital areas of the ship are secure, and there are no problems reported," Palatine Andrea Weber offered crisply. The older woman bore a beautiful face marred by burn scars. Her right cheek was a mess of scar tissue, which stopped right before it could touch the sororita's tattoo she wore proudly. Her calm hazel eyes systematically scanned everything in sight, searching for anything out of place. "That's a relief. Shall we, sister?" Wolf offered a courteous nod and waved at the armored door leading to the bridge. "After you, Missionary Wolf." Jacob nodded graciously. While not exactly a pious thing to do, watching the Sisters of Battle strut around in their combat regalia was a beautiful thing to behold both on the best and worst of days. It might be better if they were doing so out of their power armors. However, by now Jacob knew better than to ever suggest something like that aloud. What little original teeth he had left after that orc nearly caved his face in, a Sister of Battle removed at the end of his foolish youth. The sight has been almost worth a shattered jaw and nearly ending as a human torch. Almost, but not quite. It certainly wasn't worth the penance the confessor made him endure as a consequence. After those days, he had been a very respectful lad and kept his eyes and thoughts to himself. It was much safer that way. Besides, if a Sister of Battle showed an interest in him, then who he was to refuse. And it was safer that way because it helped avoid unfortunate misunderstandings. They entered the bridge together and were surprised to see the navigator outside of his alcove. The middle-aged woman had a huge smile on her face. Her two blue human eyes cried tears of apparent joy, and the third was freshly seared shut. One of the two other regular sanctioned psykers on board was present as well. That troubled young man was on his knees near the captain's throne, praying with surprising fervor. "We saw him." The navigator bounced on her heels. "His light is covering everything around us. It burned the demons away. Their screams of pain, a terror, were something to behold." "I don't know what I should pray for," Jacob quietly observed. That something so momentous happened on Kronus that required his attention twice in less than a week, or that the navigators are mistaken, and potentially compromised. The Palatine's gaze merely flickered to the squad she had stationed on the bridge. It was made of her most experienced, devoted, and level-headed sisters. They all wielded blessed weapons and were ready in case of treachery, no matter the source. She still prayed their intervention wouldn't be necessary. The navigators might be mutants, however, they were sanctioned by the God Emperor himself. They were vital for the functioning of the temple ships as well. Right now, the warp is the calmest we've ever experienced. We should arrive in the system within the hour. The captain explained, "We no longer have to plow our ways through demons. Nothing is assaulting the Geller field anymore." "I told you." The navigator skipped around happily, like a fresh novice during the Sanguiners' celebrations. "It was the Emperor." She pointed at the still praying Psyker. "We're sanctioned Psykers, bound to the Emperor himself. We felt his presence back on Holy Terror. There is no mistaking it. This is his power surrounding and protecting us. It was his presence we felt descend upon Cronis. You'll see." "Get that eye checked up and calm down." The captain rubbed his forehead. "Your thoughts, Missionary Wolf?" "This is too good to be true. My faith is strong. I pray and hope for the best. However, we must be prepared for the worst," Jacob firmly stated. The Sisters of Battle nodded in agreement. He was sure they were busy praying under their helmets. Part 2. Victory Bay. Kronus, 2 Inquisitors and a general met at the hospital, which was like the start of a bad and worn-out joke. We were still in the hospital, and this time I wasn't the one stuck in bed. That was progress, right? Still, everything, including pieces that shouldn't be there, hurt. I was able to more or less function. However, the pain was a reminder that I got myself fucked pretty bad once again. Those hit by the plague the demon unleashed upon Cronis were less fortunate. The Emperor did use me to strike down the warp component of this particularly nasty little horror, which by itself saved countless lives. Unfortunately, getting rid of it wasn't that simple. Among other things, a part of the disease was a parasite of all things. Many of those tiny bastards were still stuck in the bodies of hundreds of thousands of victims. The medicates could remove them safely. A round of 2 of powerful drugs could burn through them as well, buying some time for extraction before their corpses could begin to rot people from the inside. The issue was there were too many patients and not enough medicates to go around. Even when the naval ships in orbit offered for everyone with the relevant expertise to come down here and help, it simply wasn't enough. The most optimistic projections from our surviving Mechanicus contingent pointed at tens of thousands of deaths over the next 2 weeks, perhaps 100,000 or more if we dropped the ball. I found both Vale and Lucas stuck in the same room under heavy guard. They were getting VIP treatment, just like I did, courtesy of my wings and sparkling aura. The rest of the hospital was chock full with troopers. Most of them could barely stand, and many laid in the corridors using sleeping bags. Those were the lucky ones brought in for priority treatment, receiving the best of the quickly shrinking medicine stocks. Many of them were officers, commissars, decorated and veteran NCOs, and other personnel deemed more vital than the poor common infantry. We'll be preparing them for an operation soon. Please be brief, Inquisitor. Karam buzzed past me on his way out of the room. I'm glad to see you two are still alive and expected to recover, I greeted. To be honest, both of them looked like death warmed over. They were pale, sickly-looking, and covered in sweat. They were hooked to various machines as well, which constantly beeped and whistled, though all the lights were green, which should mean everything was as well as it could be expected. It figures you go charge a demon again, yet you're already on your feet, General Alexander rasped. I didn't believe it fully, you know. That you are a saint, I mean. He chuckled. Blessed by the Emperor? That much I could buy easy, after all, you did for my soldiers and Kronus. An actual living saint, on the other hand. He chuckled briefly and gasped for air. The Emperor kept me safe, I said, even though it was still hard to wrap my head around it. Celine kept a few others safe from Nurgle's dubious gifts. The rest of the city, I grimaced. General, you're still the military governor of Victory Bay and in charge of Cronis. Amberley, you're not only the senior Inquisitor, but a fellow member of Ordo Xenos. I trailed off when I saw the pointed looks they gave us. What did you do this time? Amberley asked in resignation. Nothing yet. However, I had a few thoughts after the medicies had apprised me of the situation. We don't have enough of them to save everyone, even if treating people is supposed to be relatively straightforward. I've been thinking there are medicies and people with similar training not too far away from here. The Tau. Amberley got it first. We can't trust them. Everyone they treat will be separated and put under quarantine until we can get ahead of this mess. Then our medicies could screen them for any unpleasant surprises left. I'm considering making an offer to the Tau, safe passage for those of their people who wish to leave Cronis in exchange for all the medical assistance they could offer the citizens of Victory Bay. You do have the authority to do so, as far as I'm concerned anyway, General Alexander stated in a neutral tone. Inquisitor Vale. The Ecclesiarchy and our colleagues would scream bloody murder. They might try to purge everyone here as tainted, or at least those touched by the Xenos. Amberley warned me, I'll deal with them when they arrive. My wings fluttered at that. It will be inevitable. Amberley looked at the unruly feathery menaces with a contemplative expression on her face. After what I'm experiencing, it would be hypocritical of me to condemn thousands to die because only the Tau might save them. Just be aware that there will be repercussions if you decide to walk this path. I doubt it would be much worse than allying with the Necrons. Our propaganda department is even considering showing them in a positive light for local consumption, which was only logical after so many people saw them fight the demon. That, in turn, was another can of worms that I would have to deal with sooner rather than later. Inquisitors would gleefully purge everyone who saw the battle for the cannon on general principle. At least a few of those were likely en route to Cronis as we spoke. You never know. Amberley cracked a mischievous smile. If you two lack outstanding objections, I'll be contacting the Tau shortly. They still haven't answered the ultimatum Captain Thula and Colonel Amundsen sent them. Offering the Tau better terms might get them to leave without a fight. That in turn would spare vital infrastructure and not adding even more bad blood that would have to be expunged if my long-term goals for the Tau could come into fruition. On a related note, how does it sound to have access to Tau war gear for inquisitorial retinues at large? I smiled at Amberley before focusing on the general. How do you feel about having a few of your regiment field test some recovered and properly sanctified weapons, armor, and vehicles? I can already hear the Mechanicus screaming for your head. Vale, please, do us all a favor and stop while you're somehow ahead. Amberley groaned. Just think about it. I'm going to play diplomat. Or's Tarshan Kronus. The starport was a mess. The last band of orcs to reach the place trashed it something fierce. They even managed to steal a transport, which they drove up to the mountains before it got shot down. The barbarians looted valuable tools, trashed expensive machinery, and ignited fuel stocks. The fierce fighting necessary to remove the last trace of the orcs saw all structures in the area damaged to some extent. The only reason everything wasn't leveled was the nature of the facility. It was built to survive heavy transport crashing during liftoff or landing due to accidents or battle damage. It was still a terrible mess and a particularly sore offense against the greater good. The smell was very offensive as well. The orc couldn't even burn without stinking up the place. We won't be able to get everyone out in time. A flustered captain from the aircast apologized from her ship in orbit. We lack the necessary landing craft, and the damage to the port isn't helping matters. She continued. She was pretty Kai's concluded. The shade of her skin, and the form of her face, and that voice. He bit his cheek. It has been too long since he had any time for something other than war, or could appreciate a female of his species not wearing power armor. While his rank had its privileges, sometimes they were a double-edged sword. I didn't expect you to, Captain. There is no blame to share, She-Oz said soothingly. There was a lot of blame to go around, beginning with the Imperials who had to invade, then the Orcs, not to mention the treacherous Eldar. Kais should have said something, damn it all, by the greater good, if they had preserved their mobile forces. Commander Honored Ethereal, we're receiving a transmission from the humans. An Inquisitor Vale. He claims to have a proposition for us. A technician ran to their makeshift command post set up in the shade of the control tower. What is left of it anyway? Vale? She-Oz turned around with surprising haste. He wasn't exactly a young or the fittest of men. Yes, the technician nodded. Patch him through. Let's see what the humans want. She-Oz ordered. This is Inquisitor Delcatar Vale. I'm speaking with the authority of all Imperial forces in this system. After recent events, the human began. He had two very large and obvious wings, twitching and moving on his back. They also glowed with oddly fascinating light. What did the human do to himself? My offer is simple. Safe passage off-world to all of your people who wish to leave. In exchange, we require the attendance of all medical personnel. You have to aid the citizens of Victory Bay who were exposed to a pathogen of warp origin. While we've been able to remove the taint with the Emperor's aid, there are hundreds of thousands infested by a parasitic organism. We can treat them, however not fast enough to avoid a significant loss of life. If you accept the exchange, say so now. If not, then we can't allow a hostile force to exist on Cronis any longer. Our navy and the ships of our allies will remove your presence with extreme prejudice. Make your decision now. There was no trace of the usual bluster coming from the Imperial humans. No frothing at the mouth belief in a false god. No sneers and casual contempt. The delivery was cold, a matter of fact, and almost emotionless. Including the part about killing everyone from orbit, something that a typical Imperial would have been obviously looking forward to. Ethereal, Kais inquired politely after She-Oz simply stared at the Inquisitor for too long without even twitching. I'm considering our options, Commander, the Ethereal said. Your options are very simple, and my patience is not infinite. You are well aware that many elements within the Imperium would consider a few tens of thousands, or even a few 100,000 civilian deaths well worth it. Vale paused. That would be a small price for the Imperium to pay for the eradication of your presence on Cronis and the destruction of your remaining assets. My generosity and ability to negotiate have their limits. You will either accept this deal and leave, or refuse and die." The human kept talking calmly, as if discussing what the mess hall might offer for dinner. Actually, it was much calmer than the last such discussion Kai's overheard. "I'll ask our medical personnel for volunteers. What equipment and medicine do you require?" she Oars eventually asked. Kai's let out a breath he didn't notice he held back. They both knew everyone would see such a request, both as order and honor they couldn't refuse. Chapter 18. Cronus, Aftermath. Chapter 18. Cronus, Aftermath, Part 3, Victory Bay. Cronus. Victory Bay was the next best thing to a ghost city. The streets were empty, save for an odd patrol made of lucky soldiers who for one reason or another avoided the disease. Most of them were vehicle crews protected by all the purity seals affixed to their machines for the parade, or mechanized infantry riding in the troop compartments of their transports for the same. They were now the only people available to keep the city under lockdown, while Astartes QRF units waited for any sign of trouble before deployment. The citizens were either stuck at home, waiting their turn for treatment at one of the many field hospitals popping up all over the place, or gathered at the nearest church if they were strong enough for it to properly pray to the emperor. Meanwhile, I had to run all over the place with my retinue, putting down fires. We had to unfuck logistics mishaps because the people usually dealing with those were too sick to do it. On 3 separate instances, I had to speak to fired-up mobs made by people who could barely stand. They claimed the disease was the Emperor's punishment for not purging Cronus from the Tau and demanded we let them go after the Blue Boys. I had to nip that talk in the bud because Tau Medicae and their human subverted auxiliaries just began to arrive in strength. The last thing anyone needed was a good old-fashioned pogrom. "Antes, speak with Captain Thule. I want the Tau presence centralized and under guard by your brothers. I trust their judgment and that they can follow orders, even if those orders didn't make sense or they didn't like them. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had to bust my ass making them and the guards stop shooting at each other, the bastards." "I'll do so." The librarian looked around. "I must warn you, Inquisitor, that many elements within the Imperium would be ready to give the Emperor's mercy to those tainted by Tau interference. Not just the people aligned by them, but those they will treat. I'll deal with those bastards when they turn up. The Emperor didn't intervene here twice, just for us to leave his people to die when we can do something about it." I barely held myself back from biting off Antaeus's head. He wasn't the first person to express such a sentiment or even point out that my political capital might be better spent elsewhere. Well, fuck them. They didn't have to endure the Emperor's attention and power twice. They had no bloody idea how far the Imperium had fallen and what a mockery of his vision it had become. I was going to do my best to unfuck the damn place one problem at a time or die trying. When I needed more political capital, well, I would need to survive the next insanity that lands in my lap, and that problem would likely take care of itself. I didn't even want to think about what I would find at Kaurava once I finally got there. A thunderhawk roared above us, hopefully signifying that Thule just dispatched some of his Astartes to babysit the Tau. Now, what was the next fire in need of putting down? The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. It was late in the evening when we retreated to barracks set up near to the General's HQ, where Colonel Amundsen was likely even busier than us. I left most of my retinue to hit the mess hall and showers and went to see the Colonel. It was one of his people who guided us from one trouble spot to the next the whole day. "Inquisitor, great work," Amundsen greeted me with a tired smile. He looked almost as pale as the sick. However, in his case, it was a combination of his pale complexion and exhaustion. "I must say that without your intervention, things would have turned up ugly on multiple occasions." My wings preened at that. I was beginning to accept my newfound status had a lot to do with resolving all issues today without having to shoot anyone. As soon as someone saw my glowing form, their attitude immediately softened and changed to be much more cooperative than one might expect. "I've got mixed news. 2 task forces arrived in the system earlier today. One is the first wave of reinforcements that should have headed our way soon after Inquisitor Vale's ship. While they're a bit late, the cruiser battle group is largely intact. They're bringing us 5 guard regiments, 3 infantry, 1 mechanized infantry, and 1 armored. They'll help us keep a lid on things until everyone is cleared for proper duty. They should be in orbit within the next 34 hours. That's good. How did they react to receiving situation reports from Kronus? They demand to talk with Inquisitor Vale, who is currently undergoing surgery. I suggested I could patch them to you, however, they refused to speak with anyone but her. Amundsen looked less than pleased at that. I wasn't particularly happy either. This spelled trouble. Why didn't you inform me earlier? There isn't much you could do, and someone had to keep the city from burning down around our ears, sir. I'm taking full responsibility. Amundsen looked me straight in the eyes without a hint of fear. All I could see was grim determination and not a little resignation. If I was a less reasonable man, I would have you shot for keeping me in the dark, Colonel. I gave him my best disapproving look. However, I'm feeling gracious today. Nevertheless, if you repeat this stunt, I'll have you shot on general principle. Is that clear? Sir, yes, sir. The man quivered like a fresh recruit, with a drill sergeant screaming in his face. What about the second group? Several temple ships led by a light cruiser. We've had no communication from them since we sent them the situation reports. Fuck me, it was the Emperor botherers. Antes, get me Captain Thule on the comm now. Colonel, hail the Armageddon. I need to speak with Captain Ignatius as well. I would need to talk with the Necrons too. Who knew what those crazy fanatics might decide to do? Part 4. His Holy Light. Dauntless-class light cruiser temple ship. En route to Cronis, Missionary Wolf gathered the principal leaders of his expedition into one of the many chapels spread throughout the temple ship. This particular temple was the nearest to the hangar, and its location made it very useful as a meeting and briefing room. As a bonus, thanks to all the blessed artifacts and frequent prayers of the deckhands, the chapel offered a layer of protection against divination from hostile forces. The sanctioned Psykers claimed so, at any rate. While Jacob had no way to know if that was true, it sounded right. He knew for a fact that prayer and faith had very real and tangible power, so why not help in this manner too? 4 of his fellow missionaries, the leader of the confessors, the captain of the militia who volunteered to come and save Cronis, and several sororitas sat on the low benches, said their prayers, and waited for Wolf to begin the meeting. He waited for the priest taking care of this particular temple to bless them all, and slowly inhaled the reassuring smoke of burning incense spiced up by holy oils. "The Emperor protects," the priest proclaimed gleefully and bowed his head, making the sign of the Aquila. Everyone stood up and responded in kind, their voices echoing off the walls. "I'll leave you to your divine work, missionary." Father Brown waved at the gathered leaders and walked out of the chapel in a swirl of stained robes. Jacob waited until the priest was out of sight, and for the Sisters of Battle guarding the entrance to confirm that no cheeky bastard was listening. When he got the all clear, he went to the altar, taking a central stage, and looked grimly at his colleagues. "You've all seen the recordings and read the reports." The contents of those documents were another reason why they met in a chapel. Going over them extracted a lot of curses from Wolf's throat. Jacob found himself muttering all the prayers praising the Emperor he knew. Wolf hoped that most of the claims in those reports were true. Must, but certainly not all. Sullen murmurs answered him. No one was particularly happy about what they learned. Sister Weber, the Palatine in charge of their sororitas contingent, was less thrilled than most. Her only son was entangled in this mess of miracles, heresy, and insanity. The commissar was up to his neck in trouble. Or he deserved all the praises, thanks, and prayers Wolf's expedition could heap upon him. The same was true about almost everyone down there. "This should be straightforward," Confessor Klein Abel grumbled. His dark eyes stared into Wolf's souls with almost frightening intensity. "Or so it would appear to some of our more overzealous colleagues." The crafty bastard smirked. Abel was an experienced defender of the faith, who was almost as large and dangerous in close quarters as Jacob. His sharp mind and zealous defense of the imperial creed caught the eye of the Ecclesiarchy a few decades ago when he served as a naval armsman on one of the temple ships. Wolf didn't know all the details. However, to the surprise of everyone involved, Abel turned out to be a surprisingly open-minded and understanding individual. While he would protect the faith with his life and even soul if it came to it, Abel was more interested in saving people's souls and helping them. In contrast, a more stereotypical confessor would busy themselves purging and burning potential heretics and punishing those following the church's tenets to the letter. The confessor was also one of Cardinal Lin's protégés, which explained a lot in Jacob's humble opinion. They'll be frothing at the mouth and screaming that Kronus must be purged with fire yesterday. Wolf allowed himself a brief moment of levity, something he wouldn't have dared in the presence of more tradition-bound members of the Ecclesiarchy. His experience as a missionary kept his eyes open for the realities of the world, which was something that factions within the Munitorum frowned upon. Those were the same factions who would gleefully purge all too many worlds on the frontiers of imperial space for both real and imaginary sins. And that was why the Cardinal offered Wolf hand-picked people for this expedition. They were supposed to save Cronis and its citizens instead of turning the planet into a crematorium. Unfortunately, the reports coming from the surface made their goals much harder than they should have been. One of those days, your mouth will get us all in trouble, Jacob. Amelia Argent gently admonished him with her motherly voice. The old woman was another proof of how atypical their expedition was. Amelia was a former medici serving the Imperial Guard who lived long enough to retire and dedicate her twilight years to spreading the Emperor's word. Most of the expedition's leaders had similar backgrounds: Guard, Navy. It didn't matter. They were all veterans and they knew the world outside of the centers of the faith. I'll be steadfast in my attempt to curb my tongue before it could get any of you into too much trouble, Amelia, Jacob said in amusement before sobering up. You were saying, Abel? It should be straightforward. We've got at least 2 Inquisitors on the ground, Ordo Xenos. It's their job to deal with the alien. Out here on the fringes, many rogue traders and Inquisitors are running around with Xeno mercenaries, equipment, or both. They're all legit and beyond reproach. Abel rolled his eyes. In theory, anyway. We've all heard the sermons against such things. Why, I listened to one of them this morning. There was that, of course. No one sane was going after Inquisitor or rogue trader plying their trade, even when doing so involved distasteful methods. In reality, some zealots tried their best to paint the whole Ecclesiarchy as unreasonable, often insane fanatics. When those were around, all bets were off. That, of course, meant that elements of their organization would happily see them all burnt on a stake for not being dutiful, zealous, and vigorous enough in executing their duties. And he went on a tangent that was best kept in the privacy of one's mind. There is a living saint down there, or the next best thing, thank you very much. The distinct, high-pitched voice of Robert Bruce, a fellow missionary, cut through the air. The tall, frail-looking man came from a moon with low gravity, and it showed. While he could handle standard Terran gravity, doing so ate at his endurance, and it was much worse when working on high-gravity worlds. Bruce met such challenges with a smile and prayer, claiming they were mere tests from the Emperor, either that of fuck-ups and lack of consideration by their superiors. There are such indications, yes, the quiet voice of Titus Questus added. The short, brown-skinned man was a testament to faith's success. He had been born on a feral world, just as the Imperium began its effort to reclaim the place. Now he traveled the stars, spreading the Emperor's word far and wide. However, we all know the odds of Inquisitor Vale receiving official recognition anytime soon are remote. Even if everyone agreed someone was a saint, pushing through the paperwork to make it official could take decades or even centuries. When some people disagreed, and Wolf was sure many would do so, in this case it could take much longer. Either that or an uncommonly distinguished career. Sister Weber, you've been unusually silent as of late. Amelia suddenly changed the topic. You know I'm biased and personally involved in this. The Palatine's voice was bitter. That's why I'll be taking you with me when I go to the surface to find out what's true, what's a fabrication, and what hasn't made it to the reports for one reason or another. It might have been years since you met your son last. However, you're the only one we have on board who knows anyone down there. Your familiarity with the lad might be vital in making certain if the locals are compromised or not. I'll do my best in the Emperor's name. Sister Weber nodded stiffly. She had a grave yet determined expression on her face. I appreciate your aid. I'll have a squad of your sisters accompany you. The rest of you will monitor what happens on the surface and act accordingly if something unfortunate happens. But first, I want to hear your honest thoughts on the situation. Kronus is crawling with Xenos, just like at least a few dozen worlds in this sector alone. The confessor began. That's why the Cardinal sent us. He knows that the situation out here isn't as clear-cut as deeper within the Imperium, where it's safer, and save for the orcs, there are hardly any Xenos running around. Yet he hasn't sent us here to purge everyone who had dealings with the alien. We need to get down there and figure out the truth ASAP. Amelia butted in. There are hundreds of thousands of sick people in need of help. They will either need our aid or the Emperor's mercy. We need to figure out which and act quickly. I agree, Questus stated firmly. We have to bring the citizens on Kronus back into the fold. By all accounts, the Emperor brought the planet itself into his light himself. His eyes sparkled with happiness at the very thought. Soon enough, Wolf had everyone's agreement, even the captain of the militia, who otherwise kept his thoughts to himself. The harder part would be to convince their people their chosen course of action would be for the best. Not all of them were as open-minded as they were, and wasn't that a contradiction? After all, an open mind was a fortress with its gates wide open. Yet a closed one could be a void ship flying without a navigator. Neither was a particularly desirable outcome. We will be firm in our faith and endure this test. Ronald continued, we won't let Xenos lead us astray from the Emperor's light, even if this time it means enduring their presence instead of purging it. That's certainly a nice way to put it, Abel laughed. General Alexander's HQ Victory Bay Cronus. A hololith came to life with a flicker of bright light and soon displayed several vaguely familiar symbols. Those are the cruisers Blessed Blade, Naginata, and Griffon, Captain Ignatius explained. You'll note they're approaching in a wedge formation with their escorts spread in front of them, sweeping for nasty surprises. The transports are moving at a much slower pace, guarded by a destroyer flotilla. This isn't an escort formation, but an assault one. Captain Thule summarized our newest brand of trouble. I can use a drink or 10, I stated blandly while staring at the hologram. It also showed the approach of the temple ships. They approached Cronus at a reasonable pace, and in a standard defensive formation. The Emperor Botherers were either willing to be reasonable, which I still had trouble wrapping my head around, or they were attempting to be sneaky. The current agreement was they would come to see me for themselves before deciding what to make of us. Our reinforcements, on the other hand, apparently didn't like the contents of our reports. I wish I could blame them. In their shoes, I would be suspicious like hell as well. Options? I asked while trying to sound calm and confident. Our naval elements in orbit are a rough match for the task force heading our way. However, unless they do something as asinine as to fire first, before reaching orbit. Captain Ignatius shrugged. We can't move anyway before the Tau ships leave, and they won't be boosting away for at least a day. Keep hailing the bloody bastards. I'll be at the field hospital. The moment Inquisitor Vale is well enough to awake, even if it takes flooding her system with stimulants, I'll have her calling them as well. If our reinforcements refuse to see reason, Captain Thule asked, we'll cross that bridge when we come up to it. It wasn't like the Blood Ravens had trouble shooting at other Imperial forces. However, after all the hard work I put in to contain that particular madness, I wasn't going to order it repeated. This bloody planet is cursed, I grumbled to myself and headed for the exit. As soon as I was out of the command center, my bodyguards fell in formation around me. Chapter 18, Parts 5 and 6. Chapter 18, Cronus, Aftermath, Part 5, Bridge, Dominator Cruiser Griffon, en route to Cronus. 12 hours before reaching orbit, the battle group concluded a deceleration burn. They continued their approach at a much slower pace. The locals kept bombarding them with hails inquiring or demanding clarification of intent. However, not a single transmission included Inquisitor Vale's codes confirming the place wasn't subverted, much less explanation from the woman herself. They did receive a confirmation from her ship that she was down with a disease, along with almost everyone in Victory Bay. That naturally only made Inquisitor Marat Chandra even more suspicious. "Daughter, what did I teach you about anything that appears too good to be true?" the demon hunter asked lightly. Captain Anastasia Chandra rolled her eyes from her command throne. Long, delicate fingers brushed her ivory locks aside, revealing several implants connecting her with the ship. "Assume it is, even when you have solid evidence to the contrary. That way, sometimes you might actually be pleasantly surprised." The captain's musical voice rang clearly over the silent bridge. It wasn't often that an Inquisitor chose their ship as transport. That was a dubious and dangerous privilege at the best of times. When said Inquisitor simply happens to be your captain's father, who by pure coincidence was on board when a distress call from the abandoned world came, well, it didn't take a genius to connect the dots. That was no coincidence. The Inquisitor suspected the nasty kind of trouble and wanted a reliable ship backing him. And what might be more reliable than your own daughter's shop? Well, possibly many things. However, no one on board was crazy enough to voice such thoughts. "Good girl." The Inquisitor spoke softly in clear approval. If someone dared look too closely, they might have even seen a hint of a smile on his scarred face. "Everything we know about recent events on Kronus points at multiple demonic incursions, a traitor invasion, and Xenos running unchecked all over the place." Chandra shook his head in exasperation. "I can ignore the latter. Ordo Xenos is known for consorting with the alien. When they see an advantage, it's their job, responsibility, and prerogative to make those choices. As long as we check everyone for technological subversion, just in case," he didn't add aloud. Undermining his fellow Inquisitors aloud in such a manner was never a good idea, no matter the company. The demonic incursions, on the other hand. Marat's smile stretched his scars into a grotesque grimace. They were a gift from a bloodletter that managed to get close to eviscerating him, just not quite close enough. The Inquisitor could almost buy a demon of Khorne, getting too eager for blood, skulls, and battle, getting over its head and under the right circumstances, getting killed for good. While hard, doing so wasn't impossible, much less unheard of. It was just that the tools necessary were almost as rare as a nice dark Eldar and much harder to find intact. 2 interventions by the Emperor himself. On this backwater world. That was the kind of insane reports you laughed at. Then you went to vigorously interrogate everyone involved, because at best they were insane lunatics, and you had to clean up after them. At worst, the divine intervention they blubbered about was infernal, and then things tended to get very ugly, very fast. Of course, this time around, someone was trying too hard, because this had a trap written all over it. Even a brand new acolyte with no experience could notice it. Unfortunately, it was a very good trap. The bait was too tempting. Marat had to go down there, investigate and see for himself. Because no matter how remote, the possibility of the xenotechnology being real and working as advertised had to be checked. Doing anything less would be treason. That, of course, made the trap so effective. The reports from the navigators and his sanctioned psyker added credence to some of the reports. However, neither truth nor innocence was proof enough. The 2 interventions by the Emperor might be indeed genuine. There might even be a real saint down there, which might make Marat's work a bit simple. None of those potential truths prevented most people down there from being subverted, corrupted, or simply deceived to serve the whims of the demonic or the alien. "We're going in. Keep the transports and their escorts far away from hostile weapons range. I want your astropaths ready to transmit messages at a moment's notice, no matter how hard or dangerous doing so might be," the Inquisitor ordered. "You're thinking about going down there alone?" Anastasia exclaimed. "With a small security detail. We're going to be bait and spring, whatever trap is waiting for us. I have to. Besides, if they open fire on us during our approach, we'll know earlier. We can perhaps take out the Imperial ships in orbit. The Xeno battle groups will be too much." Anastasia pointed out again. "I told you so, multiple times. If they're all hostile, then we're already dead. The only question is how much we would be able to do before it's over." Chandra chided gently. "We should last long enough to purge Victory Bay at the very least. Perhaps strike at the Xeno facilities on the ground." Marat looked at his daughter. More importantly, we should last long enough to warn the Imperium at large that Kronus has fallen and needs to be neutralized. And if for once you're lucky, Father. Anastasia quirked her lips in a way her mother tended to do when vexed with him. Then I'll be praising the Emperor because we finally caught a break that might change things for the better. Unfortunately, you don't believe that, Anastasia concluded. You know me. I have too many bitter experiences to seriously consider that this isn't a trap. Victory Bay, Cronis. Last night, the Imperial reinforcements finished their sharp deceleration and continued to approach at a much slower pace. This morning, the Tau finished loading as many people they could on their ships and broke orbit, boosting for the zone that would allow them to safely use FTL. Most importantly, Amberly finally left surgery, and after a few hours of recovery, Karam finally deemed her hale enough to flood with stimulants. The cyborg leaned over her hospital bed and poked her in turn with 3 injectors. Amberly's pale form stirred, shook, and she awoke with a choked gasp. Here, wide, wild eyes darted in all directions in panic, and she tried to get as far away from Karam as she could. However, she was still too weak from the operation and could do little more than struggle like a newborn kitten. See, Iafus, where are you? Help me, Vale babbled. It's all right. Karam and his friends did good work, I said in my best soothing tone, which wasn't particularly effective if Amberly's reaction was anything to go by. The patient will need a few more moments to work through the sedative's effects, Karam explained in a clinical, emotionless tone. The muscle stimulants will kick in last. That way, she'll avoid injuring herself further. He waved a scanner over Vale, whistled happily, and left. I have other people to put back together. Vale, Amberly eventually rasped, her eyes focused on me, and I could see a spark of recognition. Yes, it's me. Sorry to disappoint, I'm not your boy toy. Amberly narrowed her eyes at me. What are you babbling about? You did want your Iafus, I smirked, and earned myself a murderous glare promising retribution. Now that you're awake and in your right mind, we've got trouble. What did you do this time? Hired a band of Dark Eldar for the kicks? Nothing so perverse. I'm not a masochist, much less insane, I'll let you know. This woman knew how to hit low, damn her sharp tongue. I didn't get into these situations for the fun. Our reinforcements finally turned up. They're refusing to talk, will be in the range of the planet shortly, and are coming in attack formation. They did demand you talked with them. Get me to a communications terminal, Amberly ordered. I have a tech priest waiting nearby with the necessary equipment. We also have a group of temple ships on the way. They appear reasonable, and that has me even more concerned. You have the wings and the Emperor's blessing. You'll be dealing with the Ecclesiarchy. I'll talk with our reinforcements. Amberly raised her right hand and relaxed when she saw her rosary and symbol of office still attached to her wrist with a fine golden chain. A few minutes later, the cogboy had a secure transmitter station set up and connected with the General's HQ. From there, Colonel Amundsen and Captain Ignatius facilitated a live feed with the approaching ship. At this distance, there was almost no transmission delay. The cogboy produced a small hololith, which soon displayed a tiny figure almost completely covered by a thick leather coat. However, the clothing did little to hide the signs of sleek and advanced-looking armor protecting the man. Amberly fiddled with her rosary and looked pointedly at the figure. Is that good enough, Marat? She knew him. Now it was time to see if that was a piece of good news or not. Your codes check out, so you likely aren't an imposter. His smile was a hideous thing to behold. I was sure it could give pause to an angry orc. Now, Amberly dear, please try to convince me that you and at least a few other people down there are still sane. The reports I've read are something to behold. They're like something the propaganda department might cook up for a segmentum-wide popular holovid series. This Marat guy was surprisingly affable for Inquisitor. For that matter, I could say the same about Amberly. Was that an act? I did my bloody luck finally change for the better. Scratch that. The Emperor botherers will be touching down tonight. That was my reaction as well when I got my share of reports while on my way here. Then things happened. Amberly smirked. Yes, that. Are you trying to branch out? Is dealing with Xenos becoming too boring and predictable for you? It's all his fault. Amberly jabbed a finger in my direction. The cogboy swiped a mechadendrite my way, and presumably I was on camera now. I waved at him with a smile, and my wings fluttered happily at the attention. I swear, the damn things had a mind of their own. The supposed saint. Marat looked at me with suspicion through eyes that had seen too much horror. That's not a claim I've ever made, however people keep reaching the same conclusion thanks to these. I pointed at my wings, which spread out covering the wall and ceiling behind me as if preening. The glow supposedly helps as well. Yes, Marat said in a voice drier than the Erez Badlands. You appear to be sparkling. He kept staring at me oddly. It's a nice trick, and I would be very happy if you're the real deal. However, even if that's the case, it still doesn't mean you aren't being deceived by either aliens or chaos. Convince me what you've cooked up on Kronus isn't a threat to the Imperium at large. I'll leave it to you. I smiled at Amberly. You do have a better gift with words than me. Besides, she apparently knew this guy. Part 6. Bridge, Dominator Cruiser Griffin, en route to Cronis. You've read our reports, Marat. You've seen the combat recordings. Vale was earnest, that much Chandra could give her. Yet, while he did listen to his colleague, the Inquisitor's eyes were focused on the saint's image. The pure white wings and bright glow certainly fit. It was too bad that he had personally dealt with two demons who could pull a convincing charade when bound to demon hosts. I won't try selling you a pile of grok shit. Amberly snorted. What we have here is certainly dangerous. It could very well turn out to be a poisoned pill if it pans out. Vale muttered a curse and rubbed his forehead at that. His wings twitched in sympathy. The man obviously wasn't accustomed to Vale's antics. What makes the pylons and this alliance so dangerous are the same things making them valuable. Amberly continued, You're Malleus, Marat. You know how much of a game-changer they can be. The Xeno-build ones. Perhaps, unless we can build them ourselves in enough numbers, all I see is a nice piece of gear that can cause no end of trouble with the Mechanicus. Then you had to go full in and get as much alien technology as possible. Were you intentionally trying to get yourselves declared Hirtex on general principle or something? I know Ordo Xenos believes itself special in that regard, however. Chandra trailed off in frustration. While I'm not a psyker, everyone we have on the surface or in orbit agrees the Emperor himself intervened here twice, in the span of a week. Vale's usual calm comportment cracked. Those somewhat coherent, including a few Eldar Vale somehow roped into this insanity, are babbling about the Emperor fighting Nurgle and driving him away. Marat narrowed his eyes at the saint at that. All his experience screamed at him that this was a trap, a deception offering the Imperium all kinds of poisoned pills. Yet the bait was so tempting. Vale's wings shifted, their feathers ruffling in possible annoyance. He kept his mouth shut. Do you care to add something, Inquisitor Vale? There is nothing I can say or prove without a psyker daring look into my head. The glowing man shrugged. I wish to hear you justify your actions anyway. You'll have to do it in front of the sector conclave sooner or later. Consider this practice. Marat offered bait of his own. Amberly grimaced, and he nearly smiled. This was going to be good, wasn't it? So be it. Vale crossed his hands in front of his chest, and his wings shifted forward. The feathers puffed up and glowed a bit brighter. The Imperium is a pale shadow of what it was during the Great Crusade, or even before people let that imbecile Vandera into a position of power. Right here on Cronis, we have the Tau, aliens who just a few thousand years ago played around with stone weapons. Today they're fielding equipment for their whole military that equals and often is better than all, except the best supplied and equipped guard regiments could ever pray to use. In contrast, the Imperium as a whole keeps backsliding technologically. Instead of investing in civilized, even feudal and feral worlds to bring them to an acceptable level of industry and technology, as a matter of course, more often than not, we're content to leave such places to merely exist as practically useless balls of rock. The Mechanicus, instead of bringing us to heights of technology unseen since the dark age of technology, bickers and hoards the best toys, refuses to share its knowledge even between its own forge worlds, and is in no small part responsible for this despicable state of affairs. Well, this rant explained much. First, Vale wasn't an experienced Inquisitor, because otherwise he wouldn't have shared such sentiments ever. This was the kind of talk that got you shot. Second, the man was such a radical that he made most radical Inquisitors Mara had ever known appear Puritan in comparison. Because of this, Chandra could see Vale going all in as a matter of course and getting his hands on as much xenotechnology as he could. Now, if the man was more shrewd and experienced, had the right connections within the sector leadership, and certain infamous forged words, his insane plans might have worked. Might. Vale obviously didn't have such backing, and that by itself was going to be problematic, all things considered. Amberly knew that as well if her expression was anything to judge by. Marat briefly wondered why she hadn't taken Vale aside and explained some things to him, then shook himself. The timing of the reports and her arrival. There probably wasn't time for that. Of course, all of this only meant that instead of willful treason and heresy, Marat was merely looking at one done with the best of intentions. That was something that tended to happen quite often, especially out here on the frontier, where certain rules had to be loosened for obvious reasons. You've waited long to get this out of your system, haven't you, Inquisitor Vale? Marat probed gently. He got back a flat stare and a pair of glowing eyes staring straight into his soul. We do indeed have more complications than just the pylons to consider. Amberly valorously attempted to shift the topic to safer grounds. The Tau are standing by to their part of the agreement. She grimaced. Necron drones and servo-skull scouts confirm they pulled from the industrial zones they control without committing any easy-to-notice sabotage. They also abandoned a significant amount of war gear, primary infantry scale, though a number of their battle suits as well. That's bad enough. Marat groaned. He could imagine it. Warehouses full of alien weapons and armor, perhaps trapped, perhaps not. It didn't matter. The windfall of alien technology represented a huge problem. Yet at the same time, the ideas Vale spouted weren't exactly new. It was just that the people of similar minds knew to be much more careful, and not to ever shoot towards something this big because they knew the inevitable reprisal that would come as consequence. However, this was different, wasn't it? If Vale was actually what he appeared, if he truly had the blessing and backing of the Emperor on Holy Terror, it put everything else in perspective. That was a terrifying possibility for many reasons. If Marat let himself be blinded by it, he could easily overlook many dangers. Nevertheless, he couldn't stop asking himself, what if it was all true? The truth seldom mattered. Marat kicked himself mentally. Vale being right could be worse than the alternative, everyone down there being compromised. Because if he was genuine, if Vale pushed hard for the research, development, and incorporation of alien technology across the Imperium, then Marat was afraid to think about everything that would go wrong. Too many people would see the benefits, while as many, if not more, would only see the danger, either in the form of xenosubversion or threat to their power base. The best-case scenario could end up incredibly ugly. Did the Necrons know how much of a poisoned chalice their gifts were? If they did, that would only make them that much more dangerous as well. My ships will be in orbit shortly. Get yourselves to the starport and on board a transport. I'll wait for both of you in Griffin's hangar to determine your status. Marat finally decided. He wasn't going down there. They would come up to him, and if not, that by itself would be telling. I'll make the necessary arrangements. Vale immediately agreed. Marat nodded and cut off the connection. Anastasia, get the hangar bay secured. I want naval armsmen covering all exits with heavy weaponry. I'm going to prepare my retinue to deal with a demon if Vale is an imposter. At once, Inquisitor. His daughter promptly answered, all professional as the situation warranted. Good girl. And if he is the real deal? Then everything gets much more complicated. I might require you to make a fast trip to Stygies 7th, carrying precious cargo and messages. Chapter 18, Parts 7 and 8. Chapter 18, Kronus, Aftermath, Part 7, Hangar Bay, Dominator Cruiser Griffon, in high orbit above Kronus. A Valkyrie wearing a fresh coat of paint landed nimbly in the hangar. 2 platoons of armored naval armsmen quickly surrounded the assault transport and aimed at the ramp. A pair of interceptors hovered nearby, ready to unleash their heavy ordnance upon the Valkyrie if the situation warranted it. Marat waited nearby, taking cover behind all stack of metal crates secured to the deck with thick chains and magnetic clamps. His retinue was in the area, taking cover behind whatever they deemed best. The Inquisitor had only Jack with him, the latest Sanctified Psyker he could get his hands on. In his line of work, Psykers tended to expire even faster than usual. Many demons deemed their souls particularly delicious or found their kind offensive, like every Cornate daemon ever. By all accounts, Jack wasn't going to last long either. He was already a babbling wreck, and Marat hadn't brought him to a single proper hunt yet. "It eats the Emperor's light!" The poor bastard screamed and grabbed Chandra by the shoulders, trying to shake the Inquisitor. The light power armor he wore prevented any such abuse, and he gently removed Jack's hands from his coat, then nodded to the Psyker's current minder, a gruff, no-nonsense veteran sergeant he picked up during his last mission. The NCO pulled out a wooden club covered with rubber to minimize the damage and raised an eyebrow at Marat. Chandra nodded, and Sergeant Xerxes clobbered Jack on the back of the head. The Psyker slumped in the Inquisitor's hands until Xerxes put the club away and took the knocked-out man. "At least we have a confirmation about the blank." Marat nodded happily. "That's a piece of good news." It all but guaranteed that Vale wasn't a demon host who was a particularly smart and sneaky bastard. A few other tests involving relics would be in order, just in case. However, this was one of the more important ones. The Valkyrie's ramp went down with a clang, and the passengers disembarked quickly. Vale led the way. He carried a curious little girl on his shoulders, who notably wore a carapace armor that was a good fit for her. Marat could see the armsmen shuffle uneasy, though, to their and Anastasia's credit, they didn't waver. Neither did they do something foolish like open fire unprovoked. That could have been messy. Marat glanced at Xerxes and saw the sergeant had stashed Jack by the crates. The NCO was already back by his side, with his weapon on the ready. Chandra gave the man another nod and went to meet his fellow Inquisitors. After just a few paces, he could feel a wave of unease wash over him. However, unless he focused on the child, Marat wouldn't have been able to tell it was her. Perhaps it was her proximity with the saint, or his inexperience with blanks. By the time Chandra was in front of his fellow Inquisitors and their small retinue, a commissar, blood-raven librarian, and a few troopers, his spine felt like it wanted to crawl away. How Vale could stand to be this close to the girl, much less touch her, he would never know. It was also something worthy of study. However, this wasn't the time or place for that. "Marat, you're a sight for sore eyes." Amberley both looked and sounded happy to see him. That was never a good reaction to have as an Inquisitor. It meant you either just walked into a trap, or the situation was fucked beyond belief. In this case, it was probably both. A brief, redundant introduction followed, which were just long enough for the two priests working with Marat to arrive with their cargo. A few tests, for peace of mind if nothing else. Chandra smiled at the small group. "Let's get it over with. Off you go." Vale picked up the pariah because Marat was beginning to suspect the child was no mere blank, and gently put her on the deck. While she didn't look all too pleased, the pariah remained silent. "It might be for the best if we test the child first," Father Harris croaked. The greying man looked between the small pariah and the saint nervously, then busied himself with opening the heavy container he helped drag all the way here. They were going to do the tests out here, in the hangar. That way, in case a demon possessed someone, they could hopefully deal with it with the aid of heavy firepower. And without endangering the whole ship went without saying. While if he had to, Marat would sacrifice the Griffin and her crew without a second thought, he would very much prefer to see his daughter outlive him by a good margin. "Thank you very much." "That's a finger bone," Vale stated flatly when Father Shu reverently retrieved a piece of St. Sebastian. It was the real deal, not like the thigh of St. Helen that demons laughed at. That wasn't a good memory. "It's a relic from a saint," Shu barked. Then he caught himself and looked warily at the saint, who shook his head, took a few steps forward, and picked up the sacred relic. "Antias, would you kindly pick up Celine and show her the rest of the hangar? Perhaps after she has touched the relics without anything bursting into the fire," Vale suggested. He looked critically at the bone and shrugged. The Astartes walked forward with a surprisingly agile and quick gait for someone that large. It never ceased to amaze Marat how fast the Emperor's angels of death could move. Vale turned around, walked to the girl, and offered her the relic. She looked at the sacred bone with confusion and eventually poked her with a finger. Everyone watched with bated breath. Marat was sure that many of the armsmen expected to see the little horror burst in holy flames. Instead, she poked the relic again, shrugged, and lost interest in it. Better get her away. If it's all right? Father Shu looked nervously at Marat, who nodded lightly. The priest sagged with relief and quickly grabbed the relic from Vale's hand. He rapidly returned it to the box while muttering prayers. Those two might be useful, however. Sometimes their antics were just too much. Nevertheless, Chandra kept enduring. Having this on record and with his stamp of approval would go a long way to give legitimacy to Vale's status, and by extension, everything the crazy radical touched. Now, if only Marat could figure a way to keep the damn fool from opening his mouth in front of a conclave. Father Harris reverently pulled out the hilt of Demon Slicer, the shattered blade of Saint Yorinaga. The blank perked up at that and skipped forward before anyone could stop her. She stood in front of the priest and bounced on her feet eagerly, looking at the broken weapon in his hands. "Go on, you wanted this circus, you'll see it through to the very end." Vale smirked at them, the cheeky bastard. Harris glared at the pariah, who stared back. The pariah won the starring match in a hurry, and the priest handed her the hilt in disgust. She grabbed it happily and began swinging it with no skill and tons of energy. What's next? Holy oils? Watching if I will burst in a fire if I pray to the Emperor? Both Harris and Shu nodded in tandem. Just grab the bloody finger bone outside of the pariah's aura, and we'll go from there. Marat's patience reached his limits. To think that this sham was going to be a part of an official report with his name on it. What did he do to personally offend the Emperor? The Astartes, Antaeus, moved quickly, picked up the girl and walked away, carrying her on his shoulder. All the while, the pariah beamed and silently swung the relic. As soon as those two were far enough, Vale blazed with golden power. The priests forgot the purpose of the exercise and fell to their knees, babbling prayers. He went to the container, picked up the bone with 2 fingers, and raised it for everyone to see. The relic glowed even brighter than the radiance surrounding Vale. The saint's wings spread wide and silently fluttered in the air, illuminating the whole hangar in the process. Ave Imperator. Vale mock-saluted Marat with the relic and put it back. The Emperor protects, Vale added, and waved at the priests, who redoubled their prayers. Fine, you aren't a demon, just a pain in my ass. Amberley, go touch the relic. The rest of you too, we can't be too careful. Chandra growled. It was going to be a futile exercise. Marat knew it almost immediately, because when he glanced at the container, he could see all the blessed relics inside glow with the Emperor's power, just like Vale did. Things couldn't be simple and merely require an exterminatus, could they? The paperwork and investigations after one would be much shorter and less troublesome than this. That wasn't the end either. The Ecclesiarchy's representatives would be arriving within the hour, giving Marat just enough time to ensure Vale was the real deal and not a demon. Or to clean up the mess if he was a demon, but that was a moot point now. Amberley picked up the relic and clutched her in her palm as if it was a lifeline. She suddenly sagged in relief. You know, I was almost certain you were the real deal, hoped you were, but until we got an all clear from the Malleus, I couldn't be sure. Amberley offered Vale an apologetic look. And that was why Marat liked the woman, even if she was Ordo Xeno with all the icky things that entailed. She was properly paranoid, however. She didn't let it ruin her. Let's get to the pilot's tactical room. We need to talk before the Ecclesiarchy invades this ship. Marat grumbled. He would be dealing with the fallout of this for years to come. He was certain of it. 3 Inquisitors, an Astartes librarian, and a pariah child gathered in the tactical room. It was the beginning of a bad joke, and that neatly encapsulated Marat's life now. I won't bother asking what you were thinking, because it's obvious you weren't. Either that, or you didn't know any better. Chandra glared at the saint who held the pariah in his lap. Vale merely raised an eyebrow at Marat, while the child glared with those huge, soul-sucking eyes. Marat stoically ignored the pariah and kept his attention on Vale. If you were trying to brand everyone on Kronus as heretics in the eyes of the Mechanicus at large, you've almost succeeded, with flying colors at that. Marat nodded grimly. Our new colleague is obviously a radical. Amberley made a "what can you do" gesture. If it wasn't for the wings and the glow, perhaps beat some sense into Vale's head. I'm open to reasonable suggestions. Vale ignored Marat's glower as if it was nothing. Stygies 7th. It's a forge world in this segmentum. The tech priests there are known to be rather radical and love to study Xeno artifacts when they can get away with it. We'll contact them by astropath as soon as it becomes feasible and dispatch a ship there carrying examples of all technologies you managed to swindle from the Xenos. Marat explained his plan. If we're lucky, we can cut a deal with the Stygites. They will figure a plausible way to spread the pylon technology when they proclaim it safe and ready for deployment. Second, at least a part of your plan for the Tau War gear has merit. We can incorporate it among inquisitorial retinues, especially those of our Ordos. Amberley picked up. That was sensible. The Ordo Xenos tryhards always picked up alien toys to play with. Sometimes they even managed not to accidentally kill themselves with the Xeno equipment and put it to good use on top of that. We need the bloody guard equipped at least as well as those blue bastards. I meant it. Vale growled in frustration and his wings ruffled, mirroring his mood. Just a few thousand years ago, the Tau were stuck on their homeworld as pre-space flight society. Right now, only the Astartes and the Mechanicus elite forces could field as good or better equipment. Look me in the eyes and tell me a bunch of Xenos are smarter and better at science than humanity. Marat kept glowering. While what Vale said was true, and the bastard did raise a good point, this wasn't something anyone sane wanted to tangle with. Doing so meant going against large sections of the Mechanicus and rocking the boat to such an extent it wasn't funny. It wasn't a fight the Inquisition as a whole was certain to win. Not to mention, even a victory might taste like ashes. If you keep pushing, you're either going to get yourself killed, start a civil war, or both, Marat snapped. What should I do instead? Close my eyes, pray, and watch the Imperium and humanity keep sliding into the abyss? To hell with that. Vale all but roared, and despite the pariah in his lap, his eyes briefly glowed with golden power. The Emperor's power. Marat now had the sinking suspicion he knew what the Emperor intended with his interventions on Cronis, and that suspicion terrified the veteran demon hunter. Part 8. Dominator Cruiser Griffin, in high orbit above Cronis. Marat felt a profound sense of relief when he left the tactical room. He didn't quite run away. He was too dignified and experienced to make such a terrible example. Nevertheless, he was the first one out as soon as they got news about the Ecclesiarchy's delegation approach. In the same manner, Chandra didn't run into the hangar, doing his best to put as much distance between the abomination and her pet saint. Or was it the other way around? Anastasia, did you send our new guests a recording of the test? Marat spoke into the vox built in his armor. They saw it, Inquisitor. Despite his daughter's formal tone, Chandra could hear more than a hint of mirth in her voice. Living down those reports to the sector conclave and higher imperial authorities was going to be hard, perhaps even harder than he imagined. The Ecclesiarchy delegation claims they have seen proof enough. They can't wait to meet the saint. Those poor bastards. Marat almost smirked. Misery did indeed love company. The Inquisitor reached the landing area just in time to see an old transport shuttle ponderously make its way down. It landed with a dull clang and the hiss of stressed hydraulics. Its ramp lowered down slowly and with even more noise, amply demonstrating that it needed either more maintenance or spare parts that conspicuously lacked. Chandra grimaced when he felt the pariah's aura wash over him. His spine tried to crawl away again, and he was afraid of how the representatives of the faith would react. A fully armored sister of battle walked down first. Her armored boots clanged loudly against the deck. She towered a head above Marat, which she put to good use to scanning the area for threats. When nothing obvious materialized, she nodded once, almost certainly speaking over vox. A small, colorful group of men and women disembarked and lined up in front of Marat and his companions. By now, Amberley, Vale, and the rest of their party had caught up and stood behind him. A huge black man towered above everyone else, including the armored sister of battle. The odd exoskeleton fixed to his white and red armor helped a bit in that regard, however. Most of it was the fact that the missionary was a small mountain of muscle. Greetings and salutations in the name of the God Emperor. The huge man rumbled and grinned widely, revealing 2 rows of golden teeth. I'm missionary Jacob Wolf, the leader of this humble expedition. Inquisitor Marat Chandra, Ordo Malleus, a pleasure, he answered dryly. It was obvious this group was interested in only one thing. They all had their eyes focused behind Marat. Chandra observed with satisfaction how quickly most of those grins became rather fixed and very obviously strained. He might actually get to like that little monster, as long as she kept away from him unless there were demons around in need of vigorous banishing. Let me introduce my honored colleagues, Inquisitor Amberley Vale and the blessed by the Emperor, Inquisitor Delcatar Vale. Both serve Ordo Xenos. Marat firmly kept his glee in check so it wouldn't show. On second thought, as long as they could keep Vale reined in and away from politically volatile issues, he could prove very useful to the Inquisition. While his status as a saint wasn't officially accepted, the wings and golden radiance were clue enough, if only after ruling out a demonic possession anyway. The primary reason why was staring Marat in the face. Even with the little pariah's presence influencing them, he could clearly see the fanatic gleam in the newcomer's eyes. If handled right, this could give the Inquisition sector-wide eager Ecclesiarchy support. That was always better than the grudging support they often received from certain quarters of the church. Your Holiness, it's a privilege to meet you, one of the female priests gushed. Her head bobbed, spilling her blonde hair around her shoulders when she went into a deep cross between a bow and a curtsy. The others offered a similar sentiment in a more or less controlled fashion. A glance told Marat enough. Neither of the faithful was happy with the pariah's presence. At least they had the good sense not to bring a psyker if they suffered one in their presence in the first place. That was an amusing tangent Marat deemed better avoided. He needed his attention for the task at hand. Well, he needed Vale's attention and dubious lead, because no one was paying him attention. The Ecclesiarchy party had eyes only for the saint, and if this persisted, it was going to be an incredibly useful distraction for covert investigations. That was another way to use Vale if only the damn saint could learn to keep his mouth shut. Not that he got an opportunity to open his mouth. The floodgates opened and the priests swamped him with questions. Please tell us about the Emperor's blessing. Can you share your insights about... Would you kindly bless us in the name of the God Emperor? Only Wolf and the Sister of Battle managed to keep their mouths shut, though in the former case it was obvious that the missionary strained to hold himself back. I'm glad to meet you all. Speaking about Vale, he finally managed to get a word in between all the eager prayers and questions he got bombarded with. Let's retreat to a more comfortable setting before we proceed. Marat wasn't sure if it was a question or suggestion, however, it was more than enough to get the delegation nodding and falling in line. At that, the Inquisitor had to re-evaluate the potential influence Vale and the Inquisition could wield over the church. This could end being either a tremendous boon or a disaster in the making. A few minutes later, after they sat more or less comfortably within the tactical room, Marat concluded. Unless handled very carefully, Vale was going to be an unmitigated disaster. All it took was one not-so-innocent question from missionary Wolf. What do you want to achieve, Saint Vale? Perhaps it was better that way. Otherwise, the feathered menace might have told the same thing in front of the wrong crowd with a predictably disastrous outcome. Vale opened his mouth and began speaking. Within moments, Marat felt like shooting himself, or Vale, perhaps both. My goals, missionary Wolf. I want to save the Imperium from itself, Vale began. I want to save it from the countless enemies besieging it from within and outside. I want to bring back the Golden Age that died with the end of the Great Crusade. As Vale spoke, Marat could swear he began to lightly glow, despite the pariah in his lap. He was certainly sure he saw golden flecks forming both in the saint's eyes and those of the little abomination. The Imperium is a shadow of what it should and could be. Right here, in this very sector, we have the Tau. Just a few thousand years ago, the height of technology they knew were sharp rocks they used to bash in each other's heads. The mention of Xenos killing each other violently, predictably got a good reception. Not a bad start, even though it was never a good form to even hint at the Imperium being deficient in any way. Unfortunately, this was merely the beginning, and things went quickly downhill. Yet, right now, they're fielding technologies equal or superior to what the Imperial Guard has available on Kronus. They take for granted technological marvels that many worlds across the Imperium would never see. Vale's wings snapped open in an angry fashion and covered the bulkhead behind his back. Unsurprisingly, Vale now held the priest's rapt attention. If he didn't end up starting a crusade today, it would be a small miracle. All Marat could do was watch the train wreck in progress with sick fascination. I am not praising the Tau for their ingenuity or creativity. I am damning those who let the Imperium decay for thousands of years. How many feudal and feral worlds have you seen? How many civilized worlds are pale shadows of what they could be? Our Imperium is sick. It is slowly decaying from within, Vale proclaimed. Marat had the sick realization that the madman meant what he spouted. This wasn't just a ploy. He wasn't playing for the public. Oh no, he was earnest. He was a fanatic. And if he wasn't stopped and redirected towards less dangerous pursuits, Marat was terrified of the damage Vale could cause with the best of intentions. I have a vision, the maniac kept going. I can see us take the Tau's twisted knowledge, sanctify it in the Emperor's light and make it our own. If the Mechanicus refuses to rebuild our worlds into shining beacons of hope, then we will do it ourselves, using any means necessary. The maniac was talking about a crusade, all right, just not one aimed against external enemies. Marat looked at Vale, who had a fixed, frozen smile on her face. Even the Astartes showed his true feelings in the way his lips were firmly set in a pale line. Yet the Ecclesiarchy people lapped it all. At that point, Marat considered shooting Vale and the priests, purging them here and now, and damn the consequence. Then he keenly recalled the backing this crazy bastard received not once, but twice in the span of a week. Marat remembered his earlier conclusion and struggled not to giggle in despair. Did the Emperor truly want this? Would even he on Holy Terror contemplate such an insane course of action? And if he would, what threat was out there to warrant it? I want to see all our worlds rebuild to the highest standard. I want them covered in gleaming cities, golden domes, and clean manufacturing districts that will be the pride of the galaxy. I want to see the Imperium reverse its long decline and enter a renaissance that should have began 10,000 years ago. I want to see humanity finally grasp its birthright and leave behind this wretched age of blind ignorance and stubborn dogma. I want to see the age of reason return. I want to see the shining beacons of knowledge and progress picked up again as an inspiration for trillions. At that, the priests were on their feet, applauding and loudly proclaiming their support. Marat and Amberley shared a long look of despair.